What's up, guys? My name is Zach with Zach Chavis Films, and today's video is going to be about whether or not the Sony FX3 is the camera that's right for you in the year 2024. Now, I myself have been using the FX3 for a little over a year and a half, and I've had nothing but good experiences about it. But I know this is an expensive camera, and it might not be the camera that's perfect for everybody. So this video is going to be whether or not it's right for you and some things to look for if you're thinking about purchasing it. Now, just as a disclaimer, I am not sponsored by anybody, Sony. My page is nowhere near big enough to even have sponsors yet, so this is solely from my experiences and just to help you before you make a big purchase or not. So just for a little bit of context, my main source of income comes from weddings. So primarily I'm a wedding videographer, but I also film sports, and I just actually started working with a production company to do more commercial work, which is kind of why I invested in this camera in the first place. So 2 years ago, I was a Canon user. I was using the Canon R6. And I actually started to film weddings because the Canon R6 had great video capabilities. And as I started to film weddings, I also started to notice a few weaknesses and things that I wanted to upgrade in the future. One of them being overheating. Now, the Canon R6 was a great camera that shot in 60 frames per second at 4K, but on a hot summer day, it was guaranteed at some point to overheat, which for my line of work doing weddings is not an ideal situation to be in. Weddings aren't necessarily something that you get a second crack at, and you don't want to have in the back of your mind whether or not your camera is going to overheat. So a lot of times if I did have an outdoor wedding, I'd have to either shoot in 1080p or I just have to keep starting stopping my camera, which again is not ideal. Another limiting factor of the Canon R6 was that it had a 30-minute record limit, which I probably could work around. During the ceremony, for the longer ones, it might not be ideal, of course, especially if I'm putting it on a tripod. But again, this is just a limiting factor, and it was a great camera for the price. But these things, if you don't want to run into those problems or have that in the back of your mind, this is where you start to consider upgrading to a different camera. So when I was shopping for cameras, my first decision or my first route was to stay with Canon and look at some of the cameras that they had available, especially some of their high-end cinema cameras like the Canon C70 and the Canon R5C, both great cameras. But of course, just like anybody else, you go on YouTube, you start looking at different reviews, and I stumbled across a video shot on the Sony FX3, a short film by a filmmaker by the name of Danny Graverts. And he's actually a very good filmmaker, very influential behind some of the work that I do. I actually refer to a lot of the education that I need on this camera, amongst other things, in his videos. I suggest that you check him out if you get the chance. If you're new to filmmaking, if you are an experienced filmmaker, there's something for everybody to learn on his channel. Very genuine. I love his teaching style. But again, I came across one of his videos and I was blown away with the color science, the dynamic range that I was seeing, the highlights and the shadows and what he was able to keep. Of course, I ended up looking at more reviews in this camera, the size, the fact that it has a fan in it. The biggest thing that I saw that caught my eye or caught my attention was the dual native ISO. I had never heard of this before. Of course, Canon cameras have this too, but not to the extent that this camera did. This camera has a dual native ISO. Now, if you don't know what a dual native ISO is, it's the two ISO levels or ranges that the camera is, the picture quality is the best at. So for the Sony FX3, 800 would be the low end, and the high end is 12,800, which was incredible and extremely useful for what I do, be it that weddings aren't always in the best light, especially when it comes to the reception. So I started to get all these things that could benefit me, and as hard as it was to switch ecosystems, I didn't let that stop me from getting the camera that I thought was perfect for my situation. Now again, another key point with this camera that I kind of mentioned before is the fact that it has a fan inside. So those issues that I was running into with the Canon R6 overheating didn't exist with this camera. I didn't have to worry about it, and I could shoot for as long as I could with the battery that I had in it and the card space that I had available. So if you are a wedding filmmaker that shoots a lot of weddings outdoors, you live in an area that gets hot in the summertime, this camera probably would take care of all those ailments, or any of those concerns that you might be having with your camera now. So I definitely think with those things that I just mentioned, along with the dual native ISO, the fan, and the dynamic range and capability of this camera, that alone to me is worth its weight in gold. Another thing that I like about this camera is the fact that it is very compact. It's one of the smallest cameras that I've ever had or ever owned, but yet one of the most capable cameras that I've ever owned. Now, when it comes to Cinematography, you know, you'll learn the further into this you get that weight isn't necessarily a bad thing, especially if you start to shoot handheld, which I am starting to lean towards as of late. But when you want to put this on a gimbal, which on a wedding day you will most likely end up doing at some point, it's not that much of a hassle, and it's not too hard on your arms when you're working for 10 to 12 hours. You know, it's really light, especially when you have the camera on the gimbal and maybe just a mic on top and a monitor on the side. It's not that much weight. And when you're traveling, it's easy to put in your bag. It's easy to break down. So again, another benefit to me. But if you do want to add a little bit of weight to this, there's so much customization that you can add to this camera. Of course, you get a cage, you can add a top handle, an external battery, and other things that just add more weight to it to get rid of those micro jitters, which is a term that you will use or will hear a lot when it comes to cinematography. That's possible to get rid of when you add and rig out your camera. So that's why this camera was worth it for me and why I think it was a great choice. I've already made my money back probably within the first 2 months of owning this camera. I had consistent work from weddings and helping other wedding videographers. So it was a very easy choice for me to pick. And a lot of times other wedding videographers in my area know that I have this camera, and they know the ISO capabilities, they know the fact that it has no record limit, they know that it has a fan on it, and they will call me just for that situation. So not that that's why you should buy a camera so other people can call on you to do these things, but it is a benefit, you know. So that's why it worked for me. Now, a reason why the Fx3 might not be the camera for you, I think the biggest thing might be the price point. It is very pricey. Right now, brand new, I think it comes in at a little less than $4 grand, about $3,800. Not everybody has the money to pay for that or make that big of a purchase, and that's totally understandable. Mind you guys, it took me a while to get to this point where I am now, where I could afford a camera like that. So if you're at the beginner level where you might not have that much of a budget, there is an alternative option, a little less expensive. It's the Fx3, which packs in a lot of the same features that this camera has. It's almost the identical camera. The dual native ISO on the higher end isn't as high. I don't know the number offhand. Give me 1 second. So I just looked it up. The dual native ISO for the Fx3 is 800, the same as the Fx3, but on the higher end, the dual native ISO or the native ISO on the higher end is 2500. So not as high as the Fx3. It is a crop sensor, which will also change how your image is and also change what lenses you choose to use for that camera. But other than that, the image, the dynamic range, the picture quality is pretty much the same, given that the lighting conditions are ideal. But I think it's about half the price, maybe even less than that, especially if you think about buying it used from a website like KEH. So that is also an alternative option for that camera. Another reason that this camera might not be for you, and this is a bit nitpicky, but if you are looking for a camera with built-in ND filters, it doesn't have that. Other cameras that do have that on Sony's end is the Fx6, which I also do have. On Canon's end, this Canon C70 would be the camera that you'd be looking into. But I mean, if you can afford a camera with built-in ND filters, then you probably can afford this camera too. So just something to be aware of if that's something that was on your mind. The alternative, the fix for this, of course, would be to buy ND filters, which are filters that you screw onto the front of your lens that help you change the exposure by twisting the end of that filter. So very handy, of course, when you're in changing light, you're going in and outdoors, you want to stay at the same aperture, but you don't want to lose any of that picture quality. So again, just another bit of information before you purchase this camera. Now, if I could find any other negative thing about this camera, and it's really hard to, is that the battery life isn't that good. One battery, if you're shooting at 4K 60 or 4K 120, it might not last you more than an hour, especially on a wedding day when you're keeping your camera on consistently. But that's never an issue for me because I'm always using external batteries, which is a good idea as a cinematographer. If you are shooting weddings, if you're shooting on commercial film or on a set, you're shooting commercial work, it's probably a good idea to have an external battery that your camera can run power from so that you can consistently work for longer periods of time. So again, I've heard people say that the battery life isn't good, but that's not an issue if you have an external battery paired with your camera. Again, guys, I hope that you like this review. Maybe you're not really considering the Fx3, maybe you just saw this video by accident. Hopefully I added some input and value to what you already had. You know, again, this camera has served me very well. I'm very satisfied with it, and I am looking forward to continue to learn more about this camera. There's so much customization that you can have with this camera, and the buttons, you know, quickly switching back between the native ISOs, quickly switching back between modes of what frame rate you're shooting in, and so on and so forth. But this camera is very compatible with most of the jobs that I do. Now, I mentioned that I also have the Fx3, which I just purchased, and I'll talk more in detail about that in the future, what it's for, whether or not I use it for weddings, if it's overkill. But yeah, right now, Fx3 pretty much is in my bag for whatever I do, whether it be a wedding, sports, football, basketball, and commercial jobs that I'm starting to get now. So guys, this is a lot of info, but take with it what you will. And if you are considering buying the Fx3, look at this. If there's any other information that I, you know, skimmed over, I'm sure I did. I just kind of wanted to hit the key points, but feel free to put your input in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And in the next video, I'm going to explain how I use the Fx3 for weddings, my setup, the lenses I use, and other things, whether I use a gimbal or handheld at different times of the day. So that'll be for the next video. But for now, guys, I hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you in the next one.